We seek to gather insights into a host of issues, especially concerning religion. Though hugely helpful, religion becomes a prison if it is not transcended. Beyond religion, we meet as human beings, free to love and cherish each other. Here, we celebrate our freedom to be richly and rationally human.
Good morning. Thanks again for tuning in to our channel. We hope you've been finding these interactions helpful. And the main purpose of this is to enable us to think and consider our different facets of our day-to-day life. Once again, welcome. Morning.
Thank you.
Yeah. This morning, I would like to start by asking you,
Yes.
how does one prepare oneself
Yes.
to face
Yes.
difficult, tumultuous times that may be coming ahead of our lives?
Yes. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this program, Beyond Religion. Our attempt is to evolve a shared framework for understanding the realities of life. Very often, religion becomes an escape from reality, whereas spirituality is a creative engagement with reality, so that we are able to cope with realities meaningfully and emerge from trials and tribulations with greater strength, confidence, and effectiveness in life. This question is, I believe, an extremely important one for the simple reason that every human being will face sometime or the other very, very difficult situations. Whether you're rich or poor, male or female, makes no difference. You will face crises in life. There's no question about it. I'm sure you remember that parable Jesus Christ taught, the parable of the builders. He says, "He who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the wind beat upon it, but it did not fall because its foundation was strong. And those who do otherwise, those who hear these words and do not do them, are like those who build their houses on sand, and when troubles come, they collapse." So this reality is already very clearly addressed by Jesus Christ, because it's a very key spiritual issue. There's no question about it. Unfortunately, what happens most of the time in religion is for people to go on proclaiming some kind of false gospel, which tells the people, if you just leave everything to Jesus Christ, you will be all right and there'll be no problem, and life will be smooth sailing thereafter. There is absolutely no such teaching in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I would suggest that you read the 10th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. You will be astonished that Jesus actually tells his disciples that because they are disciples and because they lead a spiritual life, they will face greater difficulties than others. That's the reality. So it's important for us to begin to think on this issue. How does one actually prepare oneself to face difficult times? And I must tell you that if you want to lead a meaningful life, if you want to lead a godly life, you will face more difficulties, because, as I dealt with in one of the previous units, and as George Bernard Shaw said when Gandhi was shot, it is a dangerous thing to do good in this world. So there are always dangers, there are always difficulties. I'm not saying that life is only difficulties or only crises. I'm saying that in the life of every human being, in the life of every community, difficulties will come. And it is wise and necessary to prepare oneself for it. And therefore, I'm going to share maybe 3 thoughts in this context. First of all, and these three thoughts are derived from the life and role model of Jesus Christ. You would remember that before Jesus launched his public ministry, he went into the wilderness and fasted and prayed for 40 days and 40 nights.
That's right.
Now, the pattern there, which is usually not talked about, is Jesus is acquiring the inner strength required to begin and continue this great ministry. Because Jesus knew, unlike most of us, that to do this kind of work, to do godly work, is to run into serious difficulties. And if you don't prepare yourself for it, if you don't acquire the necessary inner strength for it, you will just burst like a bubble. And it's foolish to do that. Many people get into this kind of situation. Their intentions are good. They want to do something meaningful. But soon they run into rough weather and they just burst and disappear from the scene. Now, this doesn't help. So, the first principle is begin from this day onwards to acquire inner strength. Let me give you an illustration to make this clear. Now, you've seen athletes. For example, I was a tennis player and I used to practice. I was not a great tennis player, but I was a reasonably tennis player. Now, I used to practice every day for at least 2 hours. Now, that is because if you want to play a competitive game, you need to strengthen your skills. You need to develop your skills. It's not enough that on the day of the competition or the tournament, you just walk into the tennis court with a racket in hand, the most expensive racket in hand, with all the kit ready. You will do nothing. So, you look at an athlete. An athlete trains every day. I remember what P.T. Usha said. She said, when she was an active athlete, she said, every day I went into the field, died and came back. That's the extent of the exercise they do in order to prepare themselves for the competition. And this is true of all. For example, if you're a student, you need to prepare from day number 1 and not just the day before the examination. Every day matters. So this principle is extremely important. But it amazes me no end that people do not apply this principle to life. They apply this to athletics, to studies, etc. But they don't apply this to life. So in life, we need a lot of strength. And that makes a difference between wisdom and foolishness. Right? So the first thing that I notice from the example of Jesus Christ is that he acquired the strength. And look at the discipline. Look at the struggle. Fasting and praying alone in the wilderness. Not 1 day, not 2 days, not 10 days. 40 days, 40 nights. It's amazing. And at the end of that exercise, he exudes power. You know, it's an amazing state of being. So that's the first principle. The second principle I want to mention is temptation. You see, temptations come in our life. And through every temptation, we either become stronger or weaker. We will never remain the same. When you face temptations, there may be temptations to compromise. Maybe temptations to succumb to something wicked and mean in our own nature. Maybe temptation to betray the truth or whatever. Temptations come, no question about it. And in the life of every human, like I said, crisis comes in the life of every human being. Temptations also come in the life of every human being. And these temptations are there in order to enable us to test ourselves, to find where we stand. So if a temptation is faced and overcome, we emerge from that state stronger. And therefore it's a good thing. It's a good thing that we face temptations. On the other hand, if you are not vigilant and you succumb to temptations, you become much weaker. So it's very necessary that we realize that there are temptations in life and they need to be faced and overcome so that we become stronger.
I would like to interject and say I can completely attest to what you're saying, in that even in recent times, I personally have faced with certain temptations that I would say that I didn't overcome them necessarily, and I find myself in a weaker state. While you're on that point, maybe you could also enlighten us as to once we realize that it has happened, we succumb to temptation, and now yes, it is the weakness of it. But once you realize it, what should one do to make sure that doesn't happen again? We will come back to our main focus.
Yes. No, I dealt with this topic yesterday, but I'm going to again address this.
Sure.
You see, when we succumb to temptations, there are two different approaches that we see. One person may try to somehow justify it. no, it is not my fault. It is somebody else misled me, or circumstances forced me. Or some people go into denial completely. No, I did not do it, which is the fashion now. No, you will see people coming in full public view and saying, no, I did not do it. If you think of the Jawaharlal Nehru University attack issue, many of the people who were actually involved in the attack were interviewed. Each one of them said, no, I did not do it. So that is one. It's
a blatant lie.
It's supposed to be a very smart thing to do. No, it's a very, very stupid thing to do, because the same pattern will be repeated. If you want to get out of a wrong you have done, the only thing to do is to acknowledge it and acknowledge that it is a wrong thing, and then to take a decision that I'm not going to repeat it. So this is one response, the response of denial. The second response is a response of justification, self-justification. No, it's fine. In such circumstances, you also would have done it. Or, I know you did it 10 years ago, which is also a pattern that you see in political discussions. If a party is caught doing something wrong and a question is raised by the other party, this response of this party is, well, you also did it. So, therefore it is right. As two wrongs make a right. So, that's the second, the justification. The third is a spiritual response. The spiritual response is, yes, I have fallen. Yes, something wrong has happened. Yes, I am responsible for it. And I acknowledge that it is wrong. And I sincerely feel sorry for it, and I repent. And in my unit yesterday, I explained what repentance is. Repentance is the recognition of the fact that this is wrong, but that's only one half of it. The other is taking a solemn decision, depending on the grace of God, that this pattern will be overcome and that it will never be repeated. So repentance is a process of growth. Just feeling sorry is not a process of growth. Repentance is a process of growing out of a weakness towards strength.
And to break a pattern.
Break that pattern. And that is an important aspect of spiritual freedom. Otherwise, if you don't do this process to yourself, and if it doesn't happen within yourself, you stay weak. And the same pattern will repeat itself in your life time and again. And each time it repeats itself, you become weaker, and that pattern becomes stronger. Ultimately, you reach a situation where it becomes compulsive. Compulsive means you cannot help it anymore, which is a state of addiction, which means that your moral freedom is completely gone. And it's a very serious problem, and it results in a pathetic state. So now coming back to this issue, I talked about acquiring inner strength, then I talked about facing temptations. The third thing I want to talk about is to be very clear, and again this is from the life of Jesus Christ, to be very clear about the purpose of one's life. Now, the strengths that you find in Jesus Christ, the strength that you find in, for example, a person like Mahatma Gandhi, the strength that you find in somebody like Lord Buddha, it's all the same, a very clear sense of purpose. And I remember the great historian Arnold Toynbee. He wrote that most respected book in history. It's called A Study of History, where he studies the rise and fall of 23 civilizations. It is in 6 volumes, one of the monumental works in history. Now, after writing that book, he wrote another very interesting book called A Historian's Approach to Religion. Right? Now, after doing all this work, when looking back on his life, he said something very interesting. He was not a believer. In fact, he was a skeptic. But he said, looking back on my life so far, and this was the fag end of his life, he says, I recognize the great blessedness of having had a mission in my life. He's summarizing his whole life. He says, the great blessedness of having had a mission in my life. Now, I commend that to everyone, because I find most of our, especially our fellow Christians, just drifting through life. You ask somebody, what are you living for? Very often you don't get an answer. People just don't apply their minds to their own predicament. They don't ask the question, where am I headed? What am I living for? It's very important, and this is why individuals become weaker and weaker and weaker. If you look at the 20th century literature, you find that one of the most important themes is the dwindling stature of man. That is, people are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So in the 19th century, you had gigantic people. Even right up to the middle of the 20th century, you had gigantic people. But after that, what has happened? Very, very small, ordinary people. Look at the global situation. Do you come across a single person that you can actually instinctively respect? A great devastation has happened. That is because once this culture of indulgence has come in, people have lost the sense of purpose. The only purpose that people live for now is to consume maximum pleasure. There's no higher purpose in life. And pleasure is a matter of living from day to day. I have my quota of pleasure today. It just vanishes like a bubble burst. And tomorrow I have my next fix of pleasure. It goes on like, so that is not a purpose. You can't call it an aim in life. It is simply surviving from day to day, right? But the spiritual vision of life is, in contrast to this, having a clear sense of purpose. And if it's a godly purpose, then you are in a wonderful state. I can only indicate that by quoting a passage from the Bible. From the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, where we read something like this. Realizing that there is a great cloud of witness around you, run with diligence the race that is set before you, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith. The meaning is this, that if you are actually living a life characterized by a godly mission, you are not alone. You are part of this great cloud of witnesses. And there is also in front of you Jesus Christ. So this is a fabulous, glorious, powerful situation. No? If you are living a life of pleasure, you are actually alone. Life is empty. And then you don't care for anyone, no one cares for you. You are becoming weaker and weaker. It's a miserable state. So in contrast to this, you have this most glorious vision of life. And I want to say this, I've experienced it. And that's why these things speak so powerfully to me. Having a great sense of mission, or having a sense of great mission, is a source of inexhaustible strength. And such a person can actually breast the thrust of life. If the storms of life beat upon him, if the twists and turns sting him, if the earthquakes of life shatter his house, he will still not be moved, right? So that kind, and you see that described in the 46th Psalm, where the psalmist says, even if the mountains shake, if the earth shakes, the mountains go and fall into the river, and the waters of it froth and foam, I will not fear, for God is my refuge. So this kind of strength, which the world cannot give. I have to say this. There is no source in the world that can give you this strength. So this is, I have so far mentioned 3 items. One is developing inner strength through spiritual discipline. Second is facing temptations, overcoming them. Third is having a sense, a clear sense of godly mission in life. Fourth, and I'll close with that, fourth is derived from the principle of resurrection. Jesus faced all these difficulties. Because of his mission, he was crucified. But that was not the end of the story. He rose from the dead. The meaning of resurrection is, yes, you will go through difficulties. Yes, those difficulties are very, very frightening. Maybe you will die in the process, but you will not die. There is, your death is not the end of the story.
You will transcend.
No, your death is not the end of the story.
That's right.
In fact, you become more alive because you are dead. If Jesus had died a natural death, and so there were so many Jews there, we don't remember any one of them, right? Jesus is more and more alive because he fulfilled the godly purpose of his life, faced all this, and proved what it means to be gloriously free and human. Sorry. And I consider that to be a great strength. The realization that even the worst that can happen to me is not the end of my story. That even when I die, even when I am killed, I shall continue. That therefore, I am not only under the authority of the worldly people, I am under the authority of God. And therefore, my story will continue. That assurance is resurrection.
Okay.
And these four things I consider to be a source of great strength in our life. And I want to commend it to our viewers out of love and respect for each one of you. Days ahead are going to be difficult. Make no doubt about it. We are headed to very difficult times. And it is no good to be found unprepared for it. Wisdom demands that we read the signs of the times and prepare ourselves to face the challenges ahead. But I want to also say one thing very clearly. What I have learned from history also tells me that history is not guided by men, no matter who they are. Some people think they are very powerful, that the earth shakes under their feet. No, it's all an illusion. No man creates history. No man presides over history. God and God alone is the Lord of history. And therefore, what history teaches us is that there is no human agenda, no movement, no great action program initiated by the mightiest that history has seen that has reached where it was meant to reach. You remember the story of Alexander? After conquering the whole world, what happened? He just perished in a fever. And when he said, when my body is being taken out for a procession, please keep my hands out of my coffin. I want people to know that I am not taking anything of what I have conquered from this world. Right? What happened to Napoleon? Who thought Napoleon would be defeated? What happened? There is a lovely, massive novel called Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, where he talks about the Battle of Waterloo. I have read many accounts of the Battle of Waterloo, but the most enjoyable and inspiring account of the Battle of Waterloo is in a novel called Les Miserables. And there, at the end of that account, Victor Hugo asked the question, who defeated Napoleon Bonaparte? And then he goes on to answer, not the British. History defeated him because he presumed too much. He became a victim of his own delusion, and history put him down. And you know how he died? Alone, all alone. So in an island called St. Helena, where he was intensely uncomfortable. That's how people, and Hitler thought he would do, mightier than all of them. What happened? He perished in a Berlin underground bunker. Now people believe that he took cyanide or whatever. Those details are not important. But not one of them reached where they thought they would. That proves that no man is Lord of history. God and God alone is the Lord of history. Therefore, at the end of all of this, I would tell you, yes, difficult days are ahead, but end of the day, beyond the night, there is the sunrise. And all the powers of darkness will be put down, and a new age will be born, an age of freedom, an age of brotherhood, an age where people will be free to recognize the godliness in each one of them and create a new community of brotherhood, mutual respect, love, and service.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent thought for us to all meditate on. I really like what you said about history having its own purpose and power. Speaking of history, a dear friend of mine recently reminded me of an instance where Abraham Lincoln was asked, so do you think God is on the side of the north or the south? And Lincoln is said to have responded, it really doesn't matter whose side God is on. What matters is what matters is if I am on God's side.
Yes.
And that was a powerful response. So, yeah, I think it's important to realize if we are also following in the purposes of what God has for us in this life.